Shaq was minding his own business when a desperate mother ran into the hospital, her baby turning blue in her arms. She begged the doctor for help, but he just sneered and said, "Try another hospital." The ER fell silent. Nurses froze. Patients stared. But instead of arguing, Shaq stepped forward, because he had a plan. What he did next exposed corruption, got the doctor fired, and changed his family's life forever. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Lisa's heart pounded as she burst through the emergency room doors, clutching her newborn son Jordan against her chest. His tiny body felt limp, his breathing shallow and raspy. His soft brown skin, usually warm and full of life, had taken on a terrifying bluish tint. "Please, someone help my baby!" Lisa's voice cracked with desperation as she rushed to the reception desk, her arms trembling from both fear and exhaustion. The ER was busy, nurses rushing, patients waiting, machines beeping, but Lisa didn't care about anything else. All that mattered was Jordan. Behind the desk, Dr. Whitman, a tall, middle-aged man with slick-back silver hair and an air of arrogance, barely looked up from his clipboard. His white coat was pristine, his expression completely unbothered. Lisa's breath hitched. "My son! He can't breathe! He needs a doctor now!" Dr. Whitman finally glanced up, his blue eyes cold and indifferent. He let out a small scoff, shaking his head. "Maybe try a different hospital." Lisa blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. "What?" Whitman shrugged, clicking his pen lazily. "We're at capacity, and let's be real. Your kind usually comes in for things that aren't emergencies." The words hit Lisa like a slap. The room suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights too bright, the air too thick. Her baby wheezed in her arms, each breath weaker than the last. "You're really just going to let my baby die?" she cried, her voice raw with disbelief. A few nurses stopped what they were doing, their eyes widening. Patients in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty in Whitman's tone. But no one said a word. Lisa's legs shook, but she refused to break. "Please, he's only 2 weeks old. He needs oxygen. Just look at him." Whitman sighed, standing up slowly. He walked over as if he were doing her a favor, barely glancing at Jordan before shaking his head. "He looks fine. Probably just a minor cold. Go home and give him some warm milk." Lisa's stomach churned. She had never felt this helpless in her life. Then, boom! A deep, rumbling voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Oh, but it is your problem." Lisa turned, her teary eyes widening as a massive shadow loomed behind her. Dr. Whitman's smirk faltered as he looked up, way up, into the face of a 7'1" mountain of muscle. Shaquille O'Neal had just walked into the ER. The air went dead silent as Shaq took a step forward, his gaze burning into Whitman. Dr. Whitman barely spared a glance at the towering figure, now standing behind Lisa. He let out an exasperated sigh, clearly irritated that his authority was being questioned. "And who do you think you are?" he scoffed, rolling his eyes as he crossed his arms over his chest. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Nurses whispered amongst themselves. Patients in the waiting area leaned forward, some already pulling out their phones. They knew exactly who had just walked in. Lisa turned to see her unexpected defender and gasped. Standing there, arms folded, was none other than Shaquille O'Neal. His massive frame loomed over Whitman, his expression dark with barely contained anger. The room fell into a tense silence. Shaq's deep voice rumbled like thunder. "I'm the guy who's not letting this slide." For the first time that night, Dr. Whitman hesitated. His smug grin twitched. He shifted slightly, realizing that the man towering over him wasn't just some random bystander. Whitman let out a forced chuckle, trying to play it cool. "Oh, so you think you can tell me how to do my job?" Shaq stepped forward, closing the space between them, his presence alone making Whitman instinctively take a step back. The air felt heavier. "Oh, we're going to do way more than that." Shaq's voice was dangerously low, filled with a weight that made Whitman's bravado falter. Lisa clutched Jordan closer, feeling hope for the first time since she'd stepped into the ER. Whitman forced another laugh, but it came out weaker this time. Look, man, I'm just following policy. I don't owe anyone special treatment. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Special treatment? He pointed at Jordan. That's a baby struggling to breathe. And you want to talk about special treatment? Whitman shifted on his feet. It's not my fault if some people can't afford better care. Maybe she should have gone to a free clinic. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even some of the nurses, who had been silent up until now, looked disgusted. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Oh, you just messed with the wrong person. With that, he pulled out his phone. Whitman's smirk vanished. Shaq's thumb hovered over the screen. Yeah, I need you at Mercy Hospital. Now. Whitman folded his arms, attempting to maintain his smug expression, but the atmosphere in the emergency room had shifted. The energy was heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension that everyone in the room could feel. The nurses had stopped pretending to work, their eyes darting between the two men, while the security guard at the entrance took a cautious step forward, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Shaq, standing tall and unshaken, pressed his phone to his ear, his deep voice calm yet commanding. Yeah, I need you at Mercy Hospital. Now. There was no hesitation in his tone, no room for argument. His words carried weight, and even those who weren't directly involved in the conflict could tell that whatever was about to happen next would be big. Lisa, still cradling her wheezing baby, glanced between the two men, her face a mixture of hope and desperation. She didn't know exactly who Shaq was calling, but the sudden shift in Whitman's demeanor told her it was someone important. Whitman, still clinging to whatever authority he thought he had, scoffed loudly in an attempt to downplay the situation. Oh, so now you're making calls? What? You think you can intimidate me? His voice carried forced amusement, but the slight crack in his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Shaq didn't even acknowledge him as he continued listening to the person on the other end of the call. Whitman's smirk wavered slightly before he let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. And who exactly do you think you're calling? The president? He raised an eyebrow, looking around as if expecting anyone to share in his amusement. But no one was laughing. Finally, Shaq turned to him, meeting his gaze with a smirk of his own. Nah, he said, his voice smooth and unwavering. The hospital board. At that moment, whatever confidence Whitman had left drained from his face. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. One of the younger nurses gasped audibly. A few others exchanged uneasy glances, while a security guard subtly adjusted his stance, now fully attentive to what was unfolding. Whitman's fingers twitched as though he wanted to snatch the phone away, but he knew better than to try. Instead, he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. You're bluffing, he muttered, though there was no real conviction behind his words. Shaq, still holding his phone, casually turned the screen toward him, revealing the caller ID in bold letters. Eleanor Harris, chairwoman of Mercy Hospital Board. A sharp inhale was heard from one of the nurses, and a tense silence followed. For the first time all night, Whitman had nothing to say. His smirk vanished completely as realization set in. Dr. Whitman shifted uncomfortably, his once confident smirk now replaced by an awkward laugh. The tension in the emergency room had thickened, pressing in from all sides like an invisible force. Nurses whispered among themselves, exchanging uncertain glances, and the security guard near the entrance took another cautious step forward, sensing that the situation was escalating. Shaq didn't move, but his presence alone was enough to make Whitman sweat. His deep voice was steady but firm, carrying the weight of absolute authority. You got 2 minutes to treat that baby before this hospital gets shut down. Whitman scoffed, though the tremble in his voice betrayed his nerves. Oh, come on. You think you can just waltz in here and start making demands? That's not how it works. Shaq didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, towering over Whitman like a storm cloud ready to burst. You think this is a game? He asked, his tone sharp. You got a sick newborn right in front of you, a mother begging for help, and you're standing here cracking jokes. Lisa, still clutching her fragile baby to her chest, had tears streaming down her face. Jordan's tiny body shuddered with every labored breath, his lips an alarming shade of blue. Please, she whispered, her voice hoarse, Please, help him. One of the younger nurses hesitated, looking between Whitman and Shaq. Doctor, she started, but Whitman shot her a warning glare. Shaq caught it instantly. His jaw tightened. He turned his gaze toward the other hospital staff. Is this how y'all treat people here? His voice rang through the room, loud and clear. You just stand by while this man decides who lives and who dies? A heavy silence followed. The nurses looked at each other, shame flickering across some of their faces. Then one of them, an older woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda, stepped forward. No, she said, shaking her head. Her voice wavered at first. Azrania, but then it hardened. No, we don't. Before anyone could react, Linda snatched Whitman's clipboard right out of his hands. The snap of the plastic echoed through the room like a gunshot. Whitman's mouth fell open. Excuse me. You're excused, Linda snapped. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes blazed with years of pent-up frustration. I've worked at this hospital for 20 years, and I've had enough of watching you turn people away. A murmur rippled through the other nurses. Another one, a young man with dark curls, squared his shoulders. She's right. This isn't the first time. Whitman's face turned red. You're all overreacting. Shaq raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? And then before Whitman could utter another excuse, Linda spun around, grabbed Jordan from Lisa's arms and took off toward the ICU. Lisa gasped. Wait! Go with her! Shaq urged, giving Lisa a gentle push forward. Whitman's face twisted in fury, but it didn't matter. He had lost control. In a sleek, glass-walled office high above the city, Eleanor Harris sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table, reviewing reports when her phone buzzed aggressively. She frowned at the number of notifications flooding in. Her personal email, texts, even a few missed calls. Something big was happening. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, a young man with wide, panicked eyes, rushed in without waiting for permission. Ma'am, you need to see this, he said, nearly breathless. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. See what? Without answering, he hurried to the massive screen on the wall and cast a live stream onto it. The moment the video played, Eleanor's entire demeanor changed. On screen, Shaquille O'Neal stood in the middle of Mercy Hospital's emergency room, his towering presence unmistakable. His phone was aimed directly at Dr. Whitman, capturing the man's pale, sweat-slicked face. Nurses bustled in the background, a frantic urgency filling the air as a newborn was rushed toward the ICU. And then Shaq's voice rang out, deep and unwavering. This is what happens when a hospital lets racists decide who gets care. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Her grip on the conference table tightened. A flood of furious comments filled the screen beneath the video. Fire that doctor now. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Wait, is that Shaq? Mercy Hospital is done. Her assistant shifted nervously. It's already at 3 million views. People are tagging the media, the governor's office. Ma'am, this is a PR nightmare. Eleanor snapped out of her shock. Get my car. Now, the young man hesitated. Should I call the legal team? No. Eleanor grabbed her coat, her expression like stone. We're not handling this from a boardroom. We're handling this at the hospital. She marched out the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor with finality. Moments later, outside Mercy Hospital, tires screeched to a stop. The hospital doors swung open. The board had arrived. Doctor. Whitman's face was slick with sweat as he stumbled backward, eyes darting wildly around the emergency room. The hospital board had just stormed in, their expressions unreadable but filled with authority. Nurses whispered in hushed tones, some crossing their arms, others shaking their heads in disgust. The weight of the moment pressed down on Whitman's chest like a vice. This is all a misunderstanding, he blurted out, raising his hands as if to push the accusations away. That woman is exaggerating. I never refused treatment. Shaq let out a low, humorless chuckle and took a step closer, towering over the flustered doctor. Oh? His deep voice rumbled through the tense room. Let me replay the footage. He raised his phone and tapped the screen. The room filled with the crisp, damning audio of Whitman's own voice, captured on Shaq's livestream. Maybe try a different hospital. You people always act like the world owes you something. Take your sob story somewhere else. The silence in the room was suffocating. The only sounds were the beeping of hospital monitors and the faint sniffles of Lisa, who held her hands to her mouth in disbelief. Whitman's breath hitched. That's not... He turned to Eleanor Harris, the chairwoman of the hospital board, desperate. Ma'am, you know me. I've worked here for 15 years. Eleanor's cold stare didn't waver. And in just 15 seconds, you've undone every bit of that. Whitman's hands trembled. His world was crumbling around him. He turned to Shaq, his voice rising with panic. You don't understand. This is... Shaq didn't even blink. Nah, I understand perfectly. Without breaking eye contact, Shaq hit play again. This time, the video showed Whitman laughing, mocking Lisa as she begged for her baby's life. The room collectively gasped. There was no talking his way out of this. Dr. Whitman's face turned ghostly pale as Eleanor Harris, the imposing chairwoman of the hospital board, stormed forward, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Every pair of eyes in the emergency room was locked on her, waiting for what would happen next. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Dr. Whitman, office, now. Her voice was razor sharp, cutting through the room like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. Whitman's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked around frantically, as if searching for an escape route, but there was none. The walls were closing in, and the once powerful doctor now looked like a trapped animal. Shaq, arms folded across his chest, took a single step forward, towering over Whitman. What's wrong? His voice was deep, slow, mocking. You were so confident before. Whitman's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He turned to the nurses, the security guards, even the patients. But no one was on his side anymore. Lisa, still clutching her chest from the stress of the ordeal, met his gaze with tear-filled eyes. But there was no mercy in them, only the pain of a mother who nearly lost her child to his cruelty. Whitman straightened his tie, forcing his voice to remain steady. Look, I think this is all just, save it, Eleanor cut in, her expression unyielding. My office. Now. The air in the room was suffocating as Whitman shuffled forward, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As he passed by Shaq, the NBA legend leaned in slightly and muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, "You're done." Whitman flinched. Just as Whitman reached the door, Eleanor suddenly turned to Shaq. Her sharp eyes studied him for a beat before she spoke. Come with me. Shaq raised an eyebrow. The entire room stilled. What did she want with him? Dr. Whitman stumbled into the boardroom, his usual air of arrogance completely shattered. His forehead glistened with sweat, and his hands trembled as he fumbled with his tie, trying to loosen the suffocating grip around his throat. Across from him, Eleanor Harris sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her piercing eyes locked onto him like a predator studying its prey. Shaq took a seat next to her, his massive frame making the chair look almost comically small. He leaned back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but undeniably intense. A row of hospital board members sat along the sides, their gazes cold and unyielding. A large screen was mounted on the far wall, paused on a still frame of Whitman sneering at Lisa. The text overlay at the bottom read, "Live. Racist doctor refuses to treat dying baby." The view count was well into the millions. Whitman cleared his throat, attempting to find some semblance of composure. Look, this is all just a misunderstanding. Shaq cut him off with a slow, deliberate lean forward, resting his elbows on the table. His deep voice was almost calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. You really gonna sit here and lie? With millions of people watching? Whitman's jaw tightened. His beady eyes darted toward the board members, silently begging for someone to step in. But no one did. Instead, Harris reached forward and pressed play on the screen. The room filled with the sound of Whitman's own voice. Maybe try a different hospital. You people are always looking for handouts. Not my problem. Each phrase cut deeper than the last. The weight of his words seemed even heavier now, echoing through the silent room. Whitman sank lower into his chair, his face twisting in horror as if he were hearing them for the first time. One of the board members, a tall man in a navy blue suit, shook his head in disgust. You had every opportunity to help that child, and instead, you chose cruelty. Another board member, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, scoffed. This hospital has never tolerated discrimination. What makes you think you'd be the exception? Whitman stammered. I didn't mean... Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. Nah, you meant every word. His voice darkened as he locked eyes with the doctor. You thought nobody would hold you accountable. You thought you'd just get away with it. Harris let out a slow, measured breath before standing. She placed her hands flat on the table, her nails clicking against the wood. Dr. Whitman, she said, voice dripping with finality, you are terminated, effective immediately. Before Whitman could even protest, the boardroom doors swung open. Two hospital security guards stepped inside, their gazes locked onto him, waiting for the inevitable. His time was officially up. Dr. Whitman's face twisted in pure disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if he were struggling to force out a response. But before he could speak, the two security guards flanked him, their hands hovering near his shoulders in case he tried anything. The entire boardroom sat in stone-cold silence, watching him crumble under the weight of his own downfall. You can't be serious, Whitman finally croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was drained of color, beads of sweat forming along his receding hairline. I've worked here for 15 years. Harris, the chairwoman, folded her arms and shot him a look so cold it could freeze fire. Then you should have known better. Whitman's head snapped toward Shaq, desperation creeping into his eyes. This is because of him, isn't it? He spat. He's turning this into a circus. Shaq tilted his head, unimpressed. I'm turning this into a circus? No, Doc. You did that all by yourself. His deep voice carried effortlessly across the room, calm but heavy with finality. All I did was make sure people saw the truth. One of the guards cleared his throat. Let's go, Doctor. Whitman. Whitman took a shaky step back, eyes darting between the board members, as if searching for a last-minute savior. No one spoke. No one even looked at him with sympathy. He had burned every last bridge, and now he was completely alone. Then the guard placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Now. With that, Whitman was dragged out of the boardroom. His polished shoes squeaked against the tile floor as he stumbled, trying to resist, but it was useless. The doors swung open and suddenly he was in the hospital's main lobby, where everyone was waiting. The moment Whitman appeared, the entire emergency room erupted. Cheering, applause. Some nurses even whistled. Phones were out, cameras recording every second. The video was already viral, but now millions would see the moment the arrogant doctor was physically escorted out of the hospital he once ruled over. You can't do this to me, Whitman shrieked, thrashing in the guard's grip. His face was flushed red, veins bulging in his neck. I'm a doctor. I built my career here. Shaq stepped forward, towering over the scene. His massive frame cast a long shadow over Whitman, making him seem even smaller. He let a slow smirk creep onto his face. Oh, we already did. The hospital doors swung open, and outside, a swarm of reporters stood waiting. Whitman had no place left to hide. Lisa sat motionless in the cold, sterile hallway of the ICU, her eyes locked on the small glass window that separated her from her newborn son. Inside, tiny Jordan lay in a crib, hooked up to machines that monitored his every heartbeat, his chest rising and falling in fragile, uneven breaths. Nurses moved swiftly around him, adjusting tubes, checking vitals, ensuring that for the first time in hours, her baby was finally safe. Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes, but this time, they weren't from fear. She had spent what felt like an eternity fighting for her son's life, only to be met with cruelty and indifference. But now justice had been served, and she owed it all to the man standing beside her. Shaq's massive frame lowered onto the chair next to her, his deep voice breaking the silence. You holding up okay, Mama? Lisa let out a shaky breath and turned to him. I don't even know what to say. If you hadn't been there. Her voice broke, and she quickly wiped at her eyes. I don't know what I would have done. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp envelope. He held it out to her. Here, this is for you and Jordan. Lisa hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling as she slid the paper out. Her breath hitched the moment she saw what was inside. A check. A check for $100,000. Lisa's head snapped up, eyes wide in disbelief. What? Shaq? I can't. This is too much. Shaq shook his head. Nah, it's not enough if you ask me. That doctor put your baby's life at risk. You shouldn't have to struggle just because some racist fool thought he had the power to decide who deserves care. His expression hardened for a moment before softening again. This is to make sure Jordan always has what he needs. Doctor visits, medicine, whatever it takes. Lisa pressed a hand over her mouth as a sob escaped her lips. Her shoulders shook as she tried to process what was happening. She had walked into this hospital thinking she was going to lose everything. Now she was walking out with hope. She looked down at her son, still so small, still so fragile, but alive. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Shaq smiled. Just pay it forward someday. Lisa clutched the check to her chest, overwhelmed with gratitude. But before Shaq could leave, the hospital director suddenly appeared, clearing his throat. Mr. O'Neill, can we talk? Lisa sat frozen in her chair, clutching the check against her chest as if afraid it might disappear. The weight of everything, the fear, the fight, the overwhelming relief, crashed over her at once. And for the first time since she had rushed into this hospital, she let herself breathe. Across the glass window of the ICU, Jordan's tiny body rested peacefully, his breath steadier, his heartbeat strong. She turned back to Shaq, her voice trembling. I don't even know how to thank you. Shaq leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. You don't have to. He gestured toward Jordan. Isrania, his deep voice steady but kind. Just raise that little man right, and when the time comes, pay it forward. Lisa swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. She had spent her whole life struggling, always feeling like the world was stacked against her. But this moment, this act of kindness, had changed everything. Jordan stirred slightly in his crib, his tiny fingers twitching, and a fresh tear slipped down Lisa's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, nodding. I will. I swear, I will. The hospital halls, once filled with tension and chaos, were now eerily quiet. The weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air, but the energy had shifted. Nurses whispered to one another, throwing wary glances toward Shaq, as if still processing the fact that he had just turned their entire system upside down in a matter of minutes. Shaq pushed himself up from his seat, stretching his massive frame. All right, Mama, you take care of that boy. He gave Lisa a reassuring nod before turning toward the exit. But just as he stepped forward, a voice cut through the quiet. Mr. O'Neill. Shaq stopped mid-step, his head tilting slightly. The voice was firm, authoritative, but not hostile. Lisa looked up, confused, as a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit approached. His hospital ID badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. It was the hospital director. He cleared his throat, his eyes locking onto Shaq with an unreadable expression. Can we talk? Shaq narrowed his eyes slightly, his massive arms crossing over his chest. Depends, he rumbled. Are you about to thank me, or are we about to have a whole other problem? Months later, Dr. Whitman's once pristine life had crumbled into something unrecognizable. Gone were the days of walking through hospital halls with smug confidence, barking orders at nurses and looking down on the very patients he swore an oath to heal. Now all he had was a crumpled resume, a dwindling bank account, and a long list of hospitals that had slammed their doors in his face. Word had spread like wildfire. After the viral video, no reputable hospital would touch him. Even smaller private practices didn't want the bad press. His reputation was poison. But today he had one last shot, a small private clinic on the edge of town. They weren't as high profile as the hospitals that had rejected him, and he hoped, prayed, that they hadn't seen the video that had destroyed his career. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and pushed open the clinic doors. Inside, the waiting room was quiet. A few patients sat in plastic chairs, flipping through outdated magazines. The receptionist barely looked up as she gestured toward a seat. Wait there. Someone will call you soon. Whitman nodded, gripping his briefcase tightly, his palms sweating. He took a seat, bouncing his knee anxiously. And then he froze. Across the room, sitting casually in one of the waiting chairs, was a mountain of a man, Shaquille O'Neal. Dressed in a sleek suit, one ankle resting over his knee, Shaq sat scrolling through his phone. His presence was impossible to ignore. Whitman's throat went dry. His fingers gripped the armrest, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. No, this wasn't possible. Shaq looked up, locking eyes with him. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. Well, Shaq rumbled, sliding his phone into his pocket. Look who's trying to get back in the game. Whitman swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. What? What are you doing here? Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame looming. Oh, me? I'm just waiting to meet with my new staff. Whitman blinked. His stomach dropped. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, funny thing. I just bought this clinic. Before Whitman could even process the words, the receptionist's voice rang out. Doctor? Whitman? He turned just in time to see security guards walking toward him. Shaq leaned back, arms crossed. Looks like your interview's over before it even started.